3 minutes a day. That is all the time separating two groups of older adults in a Japanese longitudinal study. One group whose memory and processing scores held remarkably steady over 2 years, and one group whose scores drifted. The only consistent difference researchers could find: one group read aloud every single day. The other read silently or not at all. Now, before you dismiss that as too simple to be real, consider what is actually happening inside the brain when you read aloud versus when you read silently. They look like the same activity from the outside. They are not even close to the same activity on the inside. And after the age of 60, that distinction becomes more consequential than most of us have ever been told. Silent reading is efficient. Your eyes move, your brain decodes meaning, you absorb information. It is a one-lane road. Reading aloud is a traffic interchange. Your eyes decode the text, your brain converts those symbols into motor commands, your mouth and tongue execute precise physical movements, your ears receive the sound you just made, and your brain processes that sound as incoming language, all at the same time. Multiple systems firing in coordination, dozens of times per minute. Researchers have a name for what the brain is doing during that process. They call it self-referential encoding. When you hear your own voice saying something, your brain tags it differently than information that arrives from the outside world. Studies at the University of Waterloo found that reading words aloud to yourself significantly improves how well you remember those words later, compared to reading them silently, hearing someone else read them, or even listening to a recording of yourself. Your own live voice in real time is the key ingredient. For younger adults, this is a useful memory trick. For older adults, it may be something more important than a trick. The regions of the brain most responsible for encoding new memories and retrieving old ones, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, are also among the regions most vulnerable to age-related change. What reading aloud appears to do, based on functional imaging studies, is recruit more of those areas simultaneously, giving the brain more pathways to encode and retrieve the same piece of information. Think of it like this: if you store something in one place and that place becomes harder to access, the item is effectively lost. If you store the same thing in 3 or 4 overlapping places, losing access to one of them still leaves you with the others. Reading aloud does not just give your brain information. It gives your brain information through multiple simultaneous channels: visual, motor, auditory, and linguistic, each of which lays down its own trace. That redundancy is protective. There is a second mechanism worth understanding, and it has nothing to do with memory directly. It has to do with something called processing speed, how quickly your brain can move from receiving information to making sense of it. Processing speed is one of the cognitive measures that tends to decline earliest and most noticeably with age, and it underpins almost every other mental function: reaction time, comprehension, decision-making, following a conversation in a noisy room. Reading aloud forces your brain to coordinate processes that normally run on separate tracks, and it forces them to coordinate in real time, at speed. You cannot pause between seeing a word and saying it without losing your place. That mild, sustained pressure, having to keep up with yourself, appears to exercise the neural pathways that govern processing speed in ways that passive reading simply does not. Several studies measuring reaction time and comprehension in daily aloud readers have found modest but consistent improvements over control groups within months, not years. Then there is the language dimension. Oral language and written language are related, but they are not the same system in your brain. When you read silently, you primarily activate the written language network. When you read aloud, you activate the oral language network as well, the same one you use in conversation, storytelling, and social exchange. Keeping that network exercised appears to support verbal fluency, which is one of the first things people notice when they feel their mental sharpness starting to slip. The word that is just out of reach, the name that will not come. A research group in Tohoku, Japan, has been among the most active in this space. Their work on what they call learning therapy, which centers on reading aloud and doing simple arithmetic, done daily, showed measurable improvements in prefrontal cortex activity among older adults with mild cognitive concerns. The effect showed up not just in brain imaging, but in the daily behavior of participants who became more communicative, more socially engaged, and reported feeling more mentally alert. The researchers were careful to note that this is not treatment for any disease, but as a maintenance practice, the signal was consistent enough to replicate across multiple cohorts. What is striking about that Japanese work is what it implies about the minimum effective dose. The participants were not reading for an hour. They were reading aloud for about 5 to 10 minutes a day. Simple passages, poems, news articles, anything with continuous prose. The researchers found that the content mattered far less than the act. Reading a recipe aloud, reading a letter aloud, reading a paragraph from a novel aloud. The brain does not appear to care much what you are saying. It cares that you are doing all of those things at once. For the skeptics in the room, and this channel has always had time for a healthy skeptic, it is fair to ask whether the people who read aloud every day are simply different to begin with. Maybe they are more educated, more socially active, more health conscious overall. Researchers call this the healthy user bias, and it is a legitimate concern. The more rigorous studies in this area have tried to control for it by using randomized designs, matching participants by education level and baseline cognition, and tracking the same individuals over time. The effect persists, though the honest answer is that the field is still young and more longitudinal data would be welcome. There is also a social dimension that the numbers alone do not fully capture. Many of the people who report a daily aloud reading habit are not doing it in silence. They are reading to a partner, to a grandchild, to a pet, or even to a plant on the windowsill. The social context adds something. Eye contact, responsiveness, the small adjustments you make when you are reading to someone who is listening. These recruit additional layers of brain engagement. But even the research done with people reading entirely alone shows the effect. The company helps. It is not required. So, what does a practical version of this actually look like? The researchers are not asking for a performance. They are not asking you to stand up and project to the back of the room. A conversational voice is sufficient, quiet enough that you would not disturb someone in the next room. 3 to 10 minutes, any text with sentences, the same time each day if you can manage it, because consistency appears to matter more than duration. Morning seems to work well for most people, while the mind is fresh, but the evidence does not strongly favour one time of day over another. If you have never done this and it feels slightly strange to read to yourself out loud, that strangeness is worth noting. It is a signal that your brain is doing something unfamiliar, which is precisely the point. Novelty is one of the conditions under which the brain is most likely to strengthen connections rather than coast on old ones. A little bit of awkward is a sign that something useful is happening. Poems work particularly well for beginners, and not because there is anything mystical about poetry. Poems tend to have rhythm, which gives your mouth a pace to follow, and they tend to be short, which removes any pressure to commit to a long session. One poem, sometimes fewer than 20 lines, is enough to hit the threshold. A short news editorial works just as well. A page of a novel, a passage you have always liked. The bar for content is genuinely low. There is something else worth sitting with. One of the consistent findings in cognitive aging research is that the people who maintain the sharpest function into their 70s, 80s and beyond tend to share one trait that is harder to quantify than exercise habits or sleep duration. They stayed curious, they kept acquiring new words, new ideas, new perspectives. Reading aloud by its nature slows you down just enough to actually absorb what you are reading, to hear the sentences, to notice the language. It is in a quiet way a practice of paying attention. The cognitive test results are the headline. 3 minutes a day, consistent practice, measurable differences in memory encoding, processing speed and verbal fluency in people who do this versus people who do not. But the deeper story may be simpler than that. Your voice is one of the most powerful tools you have for making your own mind pay attention. Use it, not because a study told you to, because you have things worth remembering and a mind worth keeping sharp. And it turns out the distance between the two might be shorter than anyone expected.